The US is on a hunt. It has long been, but now it is attempting a fox hunt as its current President Trump is rounding up friends in an economic world war against Iran alone. But is Iran alone in isolation? In pulling out of the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal, the US found itself alone. All other parties to the deal stayed in, and the US had to go on a rampage to round up allies against Iran. It even had to hold a circus on somebody else's turf, referring to the proposed anti-Iran conference in Warsaw, also a failure. Anyway, the US continues to demonize Iran, but life does continue for Iran in an altered equation. Stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today for more on this tug-of-war between East and West. The Warsaw Conference was held in reduced fashion 2 days after Iran's 11th February 40th anniversary of the revolution, but not as an anti-Iran conference, as even major Western US allies frowned on it as a breach of every diplomatic nicety, especially when they want trade with Iran. The chief EU diplomat Federica Mogherini didn't attend, which says all. Palestinians tended to think, however, that the conference was never really intended as an anti-Iran summit to begin with, but as a meeting to seal the so-called deal of the century or fortify a recently emerged unholy trinity between the US, Israel and Saudi Arabia and its allies. The name tag eventually said Conference on Studying Security in West Asia, security which the US says Iran is breaching.
The US claims, and unfortunately some blindly parrot, that it is Iran which is interfering in the region. But has it ever been asked whose region? Whose region? Just glimpse at the map for a second.
Located wherever it might be, Iran has been material in maintaining peace in the Middle East.
Geographically, Iran's control over its extensive land and its intelligence power has brought peace and security not only for its region, but the West. It successfully curbs malicious activities that can destabilize the entire region and the world. If it wasn't for our government's effective control over the country, this country could have been misused as a conduit by drug lords and smugglers. The most dangerous terrorist organizations of the world could have simply taken advantage of Iran's geographical values, build better relations with smaller terrorist groups, and kill more people if Iran didn't have an effective control over its geography.
Tehran does have its concerns about a total Taliban victory in Afghanistan, but does not desire a long-term US military presence in Afghanistan, and to maintain security in the region and at its borders, it has had to negotiate with the Taliban, with knowledge of the Afghan government, of course. In December 2018, Afghan forces abandoned a remote western district bordering Iran, leaving the area to the Taliban after the government failed to supply troops stationed there. To move back to Iraq and Syria without participation in Iraq, Baghdad would have been the capital of Daesh and Iran neighbor of a Daesh state. And by siding with the Syrian government, Iran maintains it helped counter investment in groups such as Daesh and al-Nusra by some Persian Gulf Arab states.
If we have a look in Syria, the Americans have been supporting all the various Wahhabist terrorist groups operating on Syrian soil, including, yes, Al-Qaeda, including, yes, ISIS. And who has confronted those Wahhabist terrorist groups in Syria? Iran, the Iranian military, the Iranian people. And it is partly because of Iran that the terrorists in Syria have been defeated.
A secure region does not benefit them because it moves towards scientific and economic development and peace and prosperity. It's clear why they don't want it, because in that case the US's arms manufacturing companies will lose their markets. Well, this can't be good for the Americans. For the US's bloodthirsty government, its economy is highly dependent on the revenues of these arms companies. Their shutdown will deal a blow to its economy.
Given US statements that it would be pulling its troops out of Syria, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin said at the Sochi conference, where he acted as a counterweight to the Warsaw conference, that it is necessary to discuss prospects for the development of a situation in northeastern Syria. He continued, Russia, Iran and Turkey offer joint effort to restore the country into normalcy, to help Syrians in post-conflict reconstruction of their country. There are already specific results. Destabilizing factors in Syria include the fact that 30,000 Daesh or ISIS members are believed to be scattered in that country. Many Western experts predict a hasty American pullout might spawn another major battle, as Turkey attempts to crush its Kurdish foes, or as Bashar Assad's forces retake the northeast, or both. They do acknowledge, however, that the Kurds and Bashar Assad could come to a deal first. My experts, however, have tended to believe the Middle East would be better off left alone to handle its own issues, especially as the US started the wildfire in the Middle East to begin with. That's beginning with Afghanistan in 2001 and then Iraq in 2003. The prominent picture of the Middle East is dire. The Middle East, the birthplace of the 1001 Nights.
Let's talk hypothetically. If America was to withdraw from the Middle East, politically, economically and militarily, then yes, the Middle East would become a more stable region. Why? Because America's two principal allies and friends in the region, Saudi Arabia and Israel, would no longer have the blank check that it receives from America. And it is because of that blank check that Riyadh and Tel Aviv receive from Washington, which enables them to behave in such an appalling criminal manner. So, for example, regarding Israel, Israel violates Lebanese airspace and maritime waters on a regular basis. Why? Because Israel has the backing of a superpower, namely America.
Now, while the US and its axis of slighting all else are pulling off a stunt of illusion in pinning terror on Iran, they are distracting minds away from the real culprits. Who really bred the terror groups Iran now has to fight or appease to monitor? Let's hear it from some prominent American figures.
I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia, and we went to work.
And so there's no confusion left. Here's an update.
ISIS is honoring President Obama. He is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS, okay? He's the founder. He founded ISIS. And I would say the co-founder would be crooked Hillary Clinton.
But then, it wouldn't be the first time a Middle Eastern people were made to pay for a Western error and offense. While we are on the topic of demonizing Iran for the sin of another, the anti-Iran conference was planned by Brian Hook, Trump's special envoy on Iran. And the counsel for such U.S. policy is provided by the MEK terror group, feeding misinformation to U.S. politicians such as John Bolton, U.S. National Security Advisor. Or perhaps it pays to hear misinformation. Bolton did announce earlier that he would like to see the MEK set up its own presidential system in Iran.
I had said for over 10 years since coming to these events that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullahs regime in Tehran. there is a viable opposition to the rule of the Ayatollahs, and that opposition is centered in this room today. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
But who are the MEK? The MEK, or People's Mujahideen Organization, is far from popular with the Iranian people to begin with. They came to be known as the Munafiqeen, or hypocrites, as they changed color and fought on the side of the enemy. That is, they fought on the side of Iraq against Iran during the 80s war that Saddam Hussein waged on Iran.
I believe that the West, while knowing that the MKO terrorist group has killed over 17,000 in Iran, prefers to forget and not to see that. Their killings have been documented and is out there. There's also an NGO which has made an album of the victims and named it The Victims of Terror, and then presented this album in the Human Rights Council in France. Why would these EU countries provide safe haven for these terrorists and even allow them hold conferences against Iran?
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Let's hear what link there might be between the two announcements that the US would be pulling its troops out of Syria and that the US was going to rally up an anti-Iran conference in Warsaw.
The withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Syria, as announced by the U.S. President Donald Trump, has not yet been fulfilled completely. First, the withdrawal process has been too slow, and second, based on the most recent updates, around 400 of the U.S. forces will remain in Syria. It seems that Trump has changed his idea about reducing the U.S. military presence in the region, especially in Syria. The news about the U.S. withdrawal from Syria actually caused its allies in the region and some figures inside the U.S. great stress. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel thought that they were being left alone in the region. At this time, Pompeo traveled to Cairo, made a speech and ensured its allies that the U.S. will remain in the region and stick to its anti-Iranian approach.
It would appear the US is out to collect financial resources to confront Iran, while it takes care of its problems at home.
At the recent conference in Warsaw, it was very clear that the Europeans, who did not send foreign ministers to this anti-Iran conference, do not want to be a part of a confrontational situation created by America involving Iran.
Some of the Friend states absent in Warsaw met at the Sochi conference parallel to the Warsaw conference to discuss setting up a Syrian Constitution Committee to implement the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Those states were Iran, Russia and Turkey. And while we are on the matter of Iranian concerns for regional states, Iran maintains it has no presence in Yemen, and that Saudi claims to the contrary are only to give Saudi Arabia an excuse to bombard the now poorest Arab nation.
I arrived here from Sochi, where President Rouhani continued his dialogue with his Russian and Turkish counterparts on how further to promote peace in Syria. Prior to that, I visited Iraq and Lebanon, not for a few hours, but for 7 days of discussions with government officials, as well as with political, community, and business leaders on how to work together to strengthen stability and advance economic opportunity in our region. But the reckless US obsession with Iran is threatening even these hard-won victories.
A demonized Iran is having to secure its borders further while aiding stability in Afghanistan, yet another US failure in a region thousands of miles away from home. A failure to return stability to Afghanistan after 18 years' presence in that country. But Iran's maintaining stability in this very region where it belongs is painted as aiding and abetting terror by the US. And in any peace talks in Afghanistan, the Taliban must be involved. The US need search no more for an excuse. Look at this headline of the Washington Times. Iran-Al-Qaeda alliance may provide legal rationale for US military strikes. The claim is based on no proof, however. Mark Fitzpatrick of IISS, that's the International Institute for Strategic Studies, tweeted,
I imagine that at the moment war is not a matter of concern, and there are many reasons that support this claim. The US economic situation during its attack on Iraq in 2003 was totally different and much more powerful, but today its national debt amounts to beyond $22,000 billion. On the other hand, Iran is not Iraq, it is not Afghanistan. If Trump says that the US government has spent $7 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, it will have to waste twice to 3 times that amount and definitely stuck in a quagmire much worse than Iraq. In addition, Iran enjoys an unknown military power. The US does not actually know how powerful Iran is because our defense power is totally dependent on our domestic military industry.
It seems that the US's approach towards Iran is a new approach in war, a war that no missiles need to be fired in. The attacker in this new type of war uses new means such as sanctions, cyber attacks, and overthrowing of the system from within. Well, in Iran's case, I think that the US's new approach in war will not change to the old type of war, that is military attack, unless Iran provokes it with actions such as closing the Strait of Hormuz and the sort. I think that the Iranian government is handling the current situation very well and with wisdom.
Just a quick note. CNN reported that US allies Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, its main partner in the coalition in the Yemen conflict, have transferred US-made weapons to Al-Qaeda-linked fighters and other groups. Also that,
as we speak, Iraqi lawmakers are demanding the withdrawal of US forces from their land. And after more than 18 years of failure in Afghanistan, the United States is now negotiating with the Taliban to withdraw American forces from Afghanistan.
there are those US officers who are busy scrutinizing Iran, not in the hope of finding beauty there. James Malloy, commander of US Naval Forces Central Command, expressed concern over what he called Iran's possession of improved and dangerous weapons systems that can give Tehran the ability to threaten some of the world's most important waterways. The waterway in mind being the Strait of Hormuz, presumably. To listen to Minister Zarif, let's pull out our maps. And here's the Strait of Hormuz, right at the foot of Iran. It's Iranian waters, in case that matters. Vice Admiral Malloy referred to what he listed as sea mines, including acoustic and magnetic variants, weapons that could pose major risks to maritime traffic, and the S-300 missile system bought from Russia, meaning the US would have to fundamentally change how it operates in the region's critical waterways. Let's take a short news break before continuing. The Washington Times exclusive saying Iran-Al-Qaeda alliance may provide legal rationale for US military strikes continues. With the once prominent Islamic State receding from the spotlight, the Washington Times has learned that the administration is focusing increasingly on the unlikely alliance between Iran and Al-Qaeda, with what some sources say is an eye toward establishing a potential legal justification for military strikes against Iran or its proxies. Congressional and legal sources say the law may now provide a legal rationale for striking Iranian territory or proxies should President Trump decide that Tehran poses a looming threat to the US or Israel, and that economic sanctions are not strong enough to neutralize the threat. We've got Sputnik International saying Iran infiltrated US systems in response to its insolence. IRGC commander said this. Previously, Tehran boasted that it had hacked numerous U.S. military drones, allegedly obtaining intelligence and video footage from them. In 2011, an Iranian cyber warfare unit managed to take control over a U.S. RQ-170 Sentinel stealth recon UAV and land it. There's the Jerusalem Post that says Iran fights to get around U.S. sanctions in Iraq, Turkey, Russia, and Syria. Tehran is now pushing for more trade with Iraq and Russia and boasting it will not be affected by the sanctions. Iran said on Saturday it had many options to neutralize the reimposition of the sanctions on its oil exports. CNN says Iranians are paying for U.S. sanctions with their health. Ali only had 2 hours to save his baby's life. I cried and screamed, begging people to let me through, he said. The incident happened just as Iran's landmark nuclear deal with 6 world powers, led by the US, was being signed in 2015. 3-4 years later, how does the situation look like? Officially, the sanctions exempt humanitarian goods such as food, medicine, and medicinal instruments. But in reality, shortages in essential goods have affected households across the country. Not to place all the blame on the other party, but Iran did sign the JCPOA and is still in the deal. Let's hear a word from Javier Solana, a former European foreign policy chief. He spoke his piece late this February. The 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution could have offered the West an opportunity to reflect on the failure of 4 decades of disengagement to bring the Islamic Republic any closer to collapse or the region any closer to peace. Instead, the Trump administration has doubled down on hostility with nothing to show for it. The JCPOA was to control or rather choke Iran's nuclear program in return for lifting economic nuclear-related UN sanctions off that country. Iran complied, but the US backed out of the deal all the same. Now, how do we know Iran complied? Because the UN nuclear watchdog IAEA verified Iran's compliance some 13 times. And the IAEA chief Yukiya Amano reaffirmed those positive reports as recently as at a New Year's reception bringing in 2019.
Iran reasonably argues that we respected the US government and other signatories of the Iran nuclear deal by implementing our commitments fully even before they took any step regarding the sanctions. We limited our nuclear activities and the IAEA inspectors pay unexpected visits to our nuclear facilities anytime they want. Well, our question from the US government is that why don't you fulfill your commitments and why do you force the EU companies to cut economic transactions with Iran? We expect the US to take some measures and build up a fragile trust at least so that we can think about negotiation in the future. But with the current US government and the plain animosity towards Iran, negotiation is totally out of the question.
It was on 8th May 2018 when Donald Trump, famed as the deal-breaker, unilaterally backed out of the multilateral Iran nuclear deal or JCPOA of 2015. And he unilaterally reimposed sanctions on Iran in 2 rounds, hoping to bring that country's oil exports down to 0. In fact, Iranian Vice President Eshaq Jahangiri implied the anti-Iran summit or Warsaw Conference was being held because the US had failed in bringing Iran's oil exports to 0 and making it kneel to sanctions. Warsaw I now associate with Brian Hook. He did an interesting demo on how the US had preserved the Iranian embassy in Washington for the Iranian people.
We look forward to the day when we can return the keys of this embassy to a truly representative Iranian government.
The keys to the embassy undoubtedly being to topple the present Iranian government. While there are those who believe the US is the lesser of superpower evils, those keys might work both ways and could also serve the US as keys to a good many Iranian oil wells, Saudi Arabia being a good example of how a deal with the devil can go.
We protect Saudi Arabia. Would you say they're rich? And I love the king, King Solomon, but I said, King, we're protecting you. You might not be there for 2 weeks without us. You have to pay for your military.
Let's take a look at your comments now on the last episode of Iran Today. That was on the Warsaw Conference that was first announced as an anti-Iran conference. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do watch again at the same times next week and take a look at our social pages to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.